Hey, Stefan, welcome to Out of Consensus. Thank you for being here.
I'm very glad to be here, Armin.
So, Stefan, for all people that don't know you yet, can you just like quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah. So I am a senior researcher at ETH Zurich, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. And I'm also an associate of the Project on Managing the Atom at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. I have a PhD from Yale University. In a previous life, I was a U.S. government arms control official working at the U.S. Department of Energy on verification of nuclear treaties. So I have a kind of hybrid science and international security and politics background.
Which is really kind of a timely, I would say. So you know a lot about how we should think about nuclear security, and so when we kind of go and now look at Ukraine recently, or like quite a while ago, but we saw the deployment of technical or like of nuclear weapons in Belarus, and people are obviously a little bit um scared that it might get out of hand, that we see some sort of escalation spiral. In addition, we see conventional kind of, weapons are getting delivered to Ukraine in an increasingly, escalatory fashion. So, what would you tell people how to think about nuclear weapons in general, maybe, and then like in the case of Ukraine?
Yeah. So I would say, as a starting point, that the world that we live in with nuclear weapons, I would say hasn't changed very much because of the repeated nuclear threats that we've seen from Vladimir Putin. And I think that oftentimes a lot of people forget that we live in the world of nuclear deterrence, where security is believed to be provided by states by aiming nuclear weapons at population centers in other countries. And I think that what's really interesting is that after the end of the Cold War, a lot of people in the public lost sight of nuclear weapons and the nuclear issue. There wasn't really a need to talk about it. And so, what I think Vladimir Putin has done with the constant rhetoric that we've seen in the context of Ukraine is kind of reminded the public of the scary bits and pieces of the nuclear world that we live in that I think that a lot of people have forgotten about. What Putin has done essentially is, I would say, said the scary parts of nuclear deterrence out loud. And
Right.
Ukraine is really quite a fascinating case because I talk a lot with Russian colleagues in track two dialogues and other forum, and I ask them about this, about Vladimir Putin's threats and everything. And interestingly enough, the response that I get from my Russian colleagues frequently is, have you seen Putin specifically say, if you do this, I will do this? And so my Russian colleagues actually, in general, believe that Putin has not made any nuclear threats whatsoever, which is really quite fascinating. Um, and so we have this kind of legacy as far as nuclear weapons and nuclear threats go, where researchers have cataloged since 1945, like what is a nuclear threat? How many of them have happened? And depending on who you talk to, we've seen well more than 100 nuclear threats. So what Putin is doing, again, isn't new. I think is designed to scare Western countries out of direct
Right.
intervention in Ukraine. But it's really quite interesting as far as red lines go, I would say. And that is, some people thought that supplying Ukraine with conventional weapons might be a red line, that maybe training Ukrainian soldiers, that intelligence sharing, that providing Leopard tanks would be a red line. And we haven't really seen that yet. And it is kind of scary, though, if you have all these ambiguous red lines and Putin's threats or views on nuclear weapons aren't seen to be credible, because then you keep going and going and going, and then maybe potentially you have a problem, because if nuclear threats aren't seen as credible, there's a really great way to restore credibility to nuclear threats, and that is to use nuclear weapons, sadly enough. But I think it's highly unlikely that nuclear weapons would be used in the context of the war in Ukraine. And I think that this has gotten a lot of attention, of course, with the deployments to Belarus. What's really quite fascinating about this is the United States has, for a long time, maintained tactical nuclear weapons in European countries, in Germany, and Belgium, and Turkey, and Italy, and the Netherlands. And interestingly enough, for a number of years, Russia has legally objected to those and said that under the clauses of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, this shouldn't be permitted for this nuclear armed state to share its nuclear weapons with others.
Right.
Now, it seems to be in the interest of Russian security. Russia seems willing to reinterpret the law and do this. And I think that, you pointed out, Armin, I think it's true that there is a lot of fear about the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons because we're talking about moving these low-yield nuclear weapons right into Belarus, which has been a staging point for a lot of Russian offensive operations. And so I think it's important to think about, what are these tactical nuclear weapons? What are we dealing with? What, might happen if they were used? What are the scenarios? And right, tactical nuclear weapons are, nuclear weapons which are designed for use on the battlefield. If there's a conventional conflict between sides, they're supposed to tip the balance in one state's favor by using them. And they're seen as being kind of lower yield nuclear weapons. So there's this belief that they may be more usable. And what's actually kind of scary is that the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, for example, was 14 kilotons, right? 14,000 metric tons of TNT. Whereas some of the tactical nuclear weapons today have much smaller yields, but some are actually larger than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. So there could be quite catastrophic effects. But what's interesting when you think about it is what would the scenario be for Russia to use tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield? And if you look at Ukrainian forces operating in theater, the tactical nuclear weapons are most usable when you see giant clusters of forces which pose easy military targets. These are mobile operations. We're not seeing that from the Ukrainian side. There aren't things that would be a lot of great targets for tactical nuclear weapons. Interestingly enough, too, if you think about it, if Russia wants to take and hold territory, that means that if it's going to use tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield, it's going to have to potentially march its troops in theater through areas where tactical nuclear weapons have been used, which is also really complicated scenario. And a lot of the Russian soldiers who have been drafted are believed to not have proper training in essentially working in a battlefield where chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear weapons have been used. And it is also believed that they don't have all of them don't have proper personal protective equipment. So what I think about when I see this is, yes, I think that having Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus is scary. But if you go back in time historically, there were changes in place foreshadowing the deployment of Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. So I don't think they're I don't think they're as usable as people think. I think that they're perhaps a show of Russia's seriousness and Russia's intentions. And also, too, they're going to be controlled by Russian troops, Russian forces. Belarus isn't going to have the autonomous ability to use tactical nuclear weapons, despite some of the comments that Lukashenko has made about, oh, come join us, everybody can have tactical nuclear weapons, which are not very judicious comments. Right. So I guess, to really come down on it, I don't really see a scenario for tactical nuclear weapons to be used in Ukraine, because I think that even though things are not going well for Russia in the war, I think that Russia is very capable of destroying targets that it wants to destroy with conventional weapons. And I don't see what the unique military utility is attached to these tactical nuclear weapons.
I think the reason, or what's on people's mind, is really, okay, let's say this counteroffensive works. Okay, so we are pushing back Russia. So, Ukraine seems to be winning. So in conventional terms, Russia might not be able to fight back. At the same time, then people have in back of their minds, well, they will never kind of lose, right? Because they are nuclear power. And I think that these 2 points, it's very hard for them? And this is why I assume these discussions will come up if we see like a successful kind of counter offensive. Like, how would you kind of answer this in, a sentence or two? From
I mean, my sentence is that Russian officials have been pretty clear that their threshold, at least for using nuclear weapons, is the survival of the Russian state and government. And I'm not sure how losing the war in Ukraine would actually mean the end of the Russian state or government. Now, people can come up with logic trains about how this may
Sure.
deteriorate domestic political consensus around Putin. I'm not entirely convinced, but one thing to say is when Putin annexed Donetsk and Lugansk, there were people who said what Putin has now done is he has made these Russian territory. They're now part of the Russian Federation. Attacks by Ukraine in these areas will be considered to be attacks on Russia's sovereign territory, and we will see potentially nuclear weapons use. And we haven't seen that. The conflict continues. Ukraine appears to actually be taking territory back in this area. So I think that Russia is dealing with an interesting situation, and that is not only do tactical nuclear weapons not have a lot of military utility to Russia, but the reason that Russia is in part able to do what it is doing is because of support from other countries. And one of the things is everyone looks at the voting that happened in the UN General Assembly on condemning Russia's invasion. And what's not really well known to a lot of people is the countries that voted with Russia or abstained from voting with Russia, even though it's like 40 something countries, something like that, and the great majority of countries in the world voted essentially to condemn Russia. Countries that abstained or voted with Russia actually represent 52% of the world's population.
Right.
So the governments, right, which are either abstaining or voting with Russia, are the majority of the world's population. And the two key players here, right, are China and India. And China and India both are also nuclear armed states, and they continue to trade with Russia. And it's important to think about the nuclear doctrine of China and India. And China and India both have a no first use of nuclear weapons doctrine. And so their belief is that the use of nuclear weapons first in a conflict cannot be done. And it is my understanding, as reported by the news media, that China and India have been very clear with Russia that were you to use nuclear weapons, that would cross a red line with China, and it also create chaos with India as well, too. And then if you start thinking about Russia's now increased economic dependence on China for consumer goods, other products, machinery, China as an export market for Russia, as well as essentially a large market for energy, given the situation in Europe, I think that there are real consequences. So I'm not convinced that being unable to fight the conflict in Ukraine anymore is going to be enough to prompt the use of nuclear weapons. What I think we're going to get is a long-term hurting stalemate for 5, 6 years. And people forget, right? The war in Ukraine has been going on since 2014. This isn't a new thing. What is scary, though, is stalemates generally don't make either side happy. And we've seen that in the past year, more than that, between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. Long-term stalemate, right? So stalemates are volatile, dangerous, other things. But again, scenarios for the actual use of nuclear weapons by Russia and Ukraine, I just don't see very many scenarios for them to be used. And so, yeah, go ahead, please.
Then let me paraphrase the question. So you assign a very, very low probability to the use of tactical nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons in general in Ukraine. So what would you need to see to change your mind? What events? What kind of, what would you say like, oh, wow, now I need to kind of ring the alarm bell. Something has changed and, bets are off.
So one thing that I would say is when I assign a low probability to the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, I would say it is a non-zero probability, though, and that is very important. I interact with a lot of experts from a lot of different countries who have backgrounds in foreign ministries, defense ministries, militaries, and I ask the same question. And we talk about like what are percentages. And I've heard people give percentages all the way up to 20% and as low as
Oh,
less
wow.
than 1%. And if you think about, right, the statistical range of all the way up to 20%, and less than 1%, like a fraction of a percent, that's enormous. And it just shows the general lack of consensus. And it shows that anyone who tries to peg you with a very specific number is probably speculating, as we all are, because of course, only
Sure.
Putin knows what the true threshold will be. And so it is interesting, though, because let's consider the case of the Cold War going
Hmm.
back. And so we got through the Cold War without the use of nuclear weapons. And many will say this is because of nuclear deterrence. It's a stabilizing factor. It created stability between the sides. We didn't see the use of nuclear weapons because of mutually assured destruction. And I think that there's certainly a lot of truth to that as far as nuclear weapons being a stabilizing factor. But imagine if we were to, oh, I don't know, do a mathematical simulation, right? We're going to go back and we're going to simulate the Cold War 5 times, 10 times, 100 times, 10,000 times. How many times do we actually, right, get out of the Cold War without the use of nuclear weapons? My guess is the majority of the time we do get out of the Cold War without the use of nuclear weapons, but I think there will certainly be times where we actually see catastrophe and essentially, near apocalyptic type scenarios. And so I think that's something to think about as far as speculating in odds. When someone says, I put it at less than 1%, that's still a non-zero probability. And so the risk of using nuclear weapons, right, existed before February 2022, but I think it's elevated, even though it remains low. And so your direct question about like, what would I need to see to change my mind about the potential use of nuclear weapons? And that is, as I would say, the devil is in the data. And right now, in addition to intelligence agencies in the world, which obviously do this and have, classified systems of national technical
Hmm.
means to share with the public, we've seen a great rise in open source intelligence around the world. And we know that analysts can sit all over the world at their desk looking at, INSAR data and other things, and they can make determinations about things that they can see that previously only intelligence agencies of the world had access to. And it's also really beneficial, too, for national governments who don't want to reveal their sources and methods, because the US government, the Russian government, Chinese government, NATO countries reveal their satellite imagery, right? You can probably back out some of the capabilities that they have. And so, some of these companies, right, are imaging the full planet every day with satellite imagery. And so when I say the devil's in the data, is, Russian tactical nuclear weapons are kept in central storage facilities. In order to get them out, you need to take specific procedures. There need to be specific movements to increase their operational readiness. We haven't seen anything resembling that of increased Russian operational readiness for the use of nuclear weapons. And so I'll start being scared when 2 things happen. The first is rhetorical, right? And that is, if Vladimir Putin starts saying, as my Russian colleagues say, if you do this, I will use nuclear weapons, then I feel like that's elevated compared to just saying the scary details out loud. And the second thing is if I start to see movements or start hearing about actual movements of nuclear weapons and nuclear capabilities, then I think that I will be increasingly concerned.
And these movements, just that we kind of understand this leading indicator slightly better, what would like a reporting look like? Or what kind of specific kind of, because, now people would say, well, they just stationed some nuclear weapons in Belarus. So what kind of news would we need to hear?
I want to see essentially that they are taken out of central storage facilities
Right.
on mobile trailers and other things and actually deployed out in the field in strategic locations rather than sitting in a warehouse. And so there's a lot of nuclear weapons in the world that exist, and a lot of them are sitting in warehouses. And if you are planning to use nuclear weapons, 2 things matter. Well, actually, several things matter. One is you need to get those out into the field. And you need to get those deployed. You need to get them in locations. You need to get them moving around so that essentially they are not a target. So I need to see actual, I would like to see, not like to see, I obviously would not like to see, but I would need to see actually clearer rhetoric from the Russian side, and I would need to see movements to accompany those things. And I think that both of those things together matter. And what's interesting too, as well as the open source intelligence information that I talked about, one of the things we've seen too is we have seen unprecedented leaks from the Russian government during this conflict, because we know there are a lot of people in the Russian government who are essentially dissenters to the Putin ideology,
Right.
who are upset at the way this war has gone. And what's fascinating is in the past, the transparency organizations like WikiLeaks were able to get information essentially from democracies and people who were willing to release those documents. And it was much more difficult to get information from autocratic governments. But the war in Ukraine, right, has resulted in some shifts in Russia. And I believe that were Russia to be using nuclear weapons or to be seriously considering it, I think you would actually start to see leaks on Telegram channels as well, too. So I think a combination of several things. I think you'll see internal leaks from people within the Russian government who object to this, who want to make it very clear. And I think you would see actual movement of the weapons. And I think that you would see clearer rhetoric than what we've seen so far from Putin. So those things, I think, all of which would be concerning. And I would say, again, I think the probability is low, but don't rule it out. And if we start seeing those types of things happen, then we have a problem. But, one of the other things, too, is for a while in the fall and winter, nuclear salience had started to go down in the world, right? Like the initial invasion had all of these nuclear threats. Now it's starting to pop up again with certain officials, making these statements. And what's interesting about it is, Russia, much like Iran, I would say, has a tradition of political officials and military officials engaged in nuclear posturing who don't, well, actually, not Iran, they don't have nuclear weapons, engaged in missile posturing and other things, who may not actually have the authorization to do these types of things, right? Maybe they have tacit support from the top to saber rattle, but in Russia, as far as the command and control of nuclear weapons, most of the people who are making nuclear threats and talking about nuclear dynamics in the war, generals and others, actually are not authorized to use nuclear weapons in the first place. So
no, I mean, I think this is a convincing argument, and keeping these three leading indicators. So let's summarize them. So we have like rhetoric, we have movement, and we have leaks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And either of them, or like a kind of combination of these three, we would need to see before you are scared, or like we should be scared.
Well, one of the things that I tell people frequently is, if you look at the way. If you look, for example, at search trends in the world on search engines as far as nuclear salience. In February 2022, with the beginning of the war, searches for nuclear topics were up literally on Google Analytics in English and other languages. They were up thousands of percentage points, right? We've actually now established a new normal in society as far as nuclear salience and interest. So if you now look at like Google Trends data, right, like the new kind of baseline measurement of interest in nuclear weapons is higher than it was before February 2022, even though it kind of tapered off. And so I, have been working in this field. I've been doing interviews on these things, for 15 years. And when I do these types of things, I would say that in the past year and 4 months, I have done more interviews than I've done in the past decade because of the overall interest in this. Yes. And so I talk to people about everything from what are tactical and strategic nuclear weapons, what are the risks of Putin using nuclear weapons. I live here in Switzerland, so I frequently talk to people about, would the Swiss bunkers be sufficient in the case of the use of nuclear weapons? In Europe here, I, of course, talk about Zaporozhye and Russian attacks at the nuclear power plant, the largest one in Europe, in Ukraine. And in my overall kind of rhetoric that I tell people is, I work on nuclear threats across the spectrum, and I think about them every day, right? That is my professional life. I'm frequently doing it. And am I scared? On some level, yes. But if we think about what's going on in Ukraine with targeting of civilians, schools, hospitals, children, transit stations,
Right.
the situation on the ground is really terrible. And the thing that keeps me awake at night about Ukraine is actually not nuclear weapons. There's no reason, I think personally, why everyone's grandma needs to be scared that, the nuclear weapons threats of the Cold War and duck and cover
Sure.
are here to stay.
I mean, I'm here in Asia, and for investors, or other decision makers, it's definitely a topic, or like probably one of the largest topics is security. I mean, the region, I think we know that, and there's always, and that's why I guess, like, want to move away a little bit from Ukraine, because you have interesting views or out of consensus views of nuclear proliferation and or like deterrence in general. And there's always the scenario that people are citing here in Asia, which is okay, so the US is somehow losing, whatever losing means, or kind of withdrawing from Asia,
Mhm.
losing in the sense of maybe like Taiwan in whatever shape or form. And a country like Japan obviously cannot just, go home. So everyone would assumes that with the people that I talk to, they would just go nuclear on
Mhm.
like, the day after. And
Mhm.
you disagree with this view. Talk
I
us
do.
through it.
Well, I mean, a few things. One of the things that a lot of people don't know is despite what happened to Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for several decades after the end of World War II, Japan actually carried out scientific and technical studies on developing nuclear weapons.
Right.
So the fact that Japan has, first of all, carried out scientific and technical studies on developing nuclear weapons, has a very difficult security situation, China, North Korea. Um, those things I think worry people a little bit about potential nuclear proliferation in Japan. And, also the fact that Japan has pursuing a closed nuclear fuel cycle. And so Japan has, if you look at it, Japan has more plutonium sitting around than many states which are armed with nuclear weapons. And so I think that that is very concerning to countries as far as the idea of Japan having a virtual nuclear arsenal which could be weaponized. My response to this is multifold. The first is I think that the nuclear taboo in Japan remains incredibly strong amongst the population to the point that a government that decided to develop nuclear weapons would risk falling and disappearing. I think it could actually disrupt the long-term trend of LDP power being in power in Japan. So I have done public opinion surveying in Japan on nuclear weapons
But the
and
public
disarmament.
opinion survey, would it actually be valid in any way after an event that the US is withdrawing? I think because, just to separate these two scenarios, like everything today, yeah, fine, I believe the surveys, but I would not believe the surveys, in such a scenario.
So I think a situation in which the United States completely were to withdraw from Asia, and that's the end of the US strategic pivot to Asia, I think that you're right, that I think that public opinion of the people in Japan on nuclear weapons would probably be disregarded by the government, even if people didn't want, right, to have nuclear weapons. I think the government would take things into its own hands. However, Japan has made in recent years more investments in its own conventional weapon systems, including looking at long range precision conventional missiles. And what I think is really interesting about this is these can actually have an effect which is partly equivalent to nuclear weapons. And the reason
Hmm.
why is I'll point to the case of Taiwan. Now, we're right now seeing what's happened when a hydroelectric dam was destroyed in Ukraine and what those implications are. Taiwan has conventionally armed ballistic and cruise missiles. And Taiwanese decision makers in the past have been pretty clear. They are aiming those weapons at Chinese hydroelectric dams. And that is that they don't need to use nuclear weapons necessarily, because we're talking downstream, potentially tens of millions of people could be killed. Would Taiwan actually do that? I don't know, right? I think there's difficult to imagine Taiwan doing that for a number of reasons, cultural commonalities, public opinion, other things. But it points to the idea that you may not actually need nuclear weapons, right, to have that same sort of strategic effect. And I also don't believe, I do believe that in some cases it can be perceived as seeing a weakening of U.S. influence in Asia. But I think the recent Washington declaration with South Korea, where the United States and South Korea now gets greater U.S. security assurances, and South Korea is going to now have joint military planning on nuclear weapons with the United States and joint exercises. And so one of the things that I think is going to happen in the future is I think that the changing dynamics of the security situation in Asia are going to force the US to have to retool its alliances with Asian countries. And that is, South Korea is heavily under the US umbrella. Not just under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, right, has 30 or 40,000 American soldiers on the ground to serve as a tripwire so that if they were killed by North Korea, that forces the hand of the U.S. president. But yet, we saw President Yoon back in January talking about the potential of South Korea indigenously developing nuclear weapons or wanting to have nuclear weapons on its territory. And public opinion polls in South Korea are the polar opposite of Japan. Japan, 75% of the population wants nuclear disarmament. South Korea, 70% of the population wants nuclear weapons. And so I think that what Yoon was doing was a lot of posturing, essentially playing the nuclear card, so popular, garner political support. But what he did do is he forced the hand of the United States to retool the alliance. And that is that countries in Asia are finding themselves in this very strange situation where they're not clear if if things will result with China's expanding influence in a situation of abandonment by the United States or entrapment by the United States, where if they don't get to participate in joint military planning in the use of nuclear weapons, the United States may do something in Asia, purportedly in the name of defending its allies, that could drag them into a conflict, right? So you better believe, right, for example, that Japan is very interested in these dynamics that are going on in South Korea. Now South Korea gets to have the potential to be involved in joint nuclear planning and have a greater say over how the United States might use nuclear weapons to defend South Korea. I can only imagine that Japan, for instance, will want the same thing. And so right now, when we think about what the U.S. nuclear umbrella looks like in the world, right? It's now that Finland has joined NATO. It's the 30 countries that are in NATO besides the United States. It's Australia, it's South Korea, it's Japan. I think that with China's expanding influence and the growth of the Chinese nuclear arsenal, which we now see growing exponentially more than had been anticipated, they're actually building out their nuclear arsenal as far as open sources quite a bit faster. I think there's going to be a greater interest in U.S. protection from countries in Southeast Asia as well, too, who will want to retool their relationships with the United States. And the question is what will Washington be able to give these countries? Will the countries be interested in what Washington has to offer? And how much essentially joint capabilities and planning will the United States be willing to facilitate? Frankly speaking, in the past, the United States was able to skate by with this hub and spokes network of alliances in Asia, where just being allied with the United States is enough, and having these types of assurances and having good economic relations. I think in the future, as we see great power competition, if the United States wants to provide a viable alternative to China and to remain in the region, I think over the next I wouldn't even say 5-10 years. I think we're going to see a restructuring of U.S. alliances, new treaties, new basing arrangements, things like that. That's just, speculative. But I think that Japan is probably next in line to think about how to do these things. And one thing that I would mention, too, is it can go the opposite way, too. The Marshall Islands just recently renegotiated their compact agreement with the United States as far as basing transit rights. And the Marshall Islands was a country which was site of U.S. nuclear explosive tests during the Cold War. And the Marshall Islands actually conditioned their compact with the United States on the United States providing more money towards essentially victim compensation and environmental remediation. So it's difficult to say where these things go and what countries want. But I think that as we see great power competition between China and the United States, I think the United States doesn't have the free hand that it once had in its partnerships. And we're going to see it having to make a lot more concessions.
That's very interesting, especially if you see this already in the economic sphere as well. Okay, Stefan, before I let you go and we wrap this up, you mentioned before we hit the record button that you have some interesting view about energy markets, nuclear energy markets. Do you want to, just like, give us a little bit of the opinion?
Well, the thing that I would say about nuclear energy markets and where we're heading is think people haven't fully unpacked the implications of the war in Ukraine for the long-term prospects of nuclear energy.
Right.
And I'm now starting to do surveys with a large group of people, global surveys actually, in several dozen countries, and trying to figure out, what are the results of the war in Ukraine. And there are two dueling dynamics here that I think are really important. One is the energy crisis, which has been created by countries cutting off oil, natural gas exports from Russia and sanctions markets, and Russia having to find new markets. And we've seen, for example, in Germany, that the plan post Fukushima to turn off all of the nuclear power plants, well, their lifespan has been delayed. But so I think that's on one hand, that might be appealing as far as nuclear energy as a viable alternative, thinking about climate change, but also the energy crisis. But on the other hand, I'm sitting here in Europe where I have interviews with the media from several different countries about what are the nuclear risks at Zaporozhye and Russian conventional military activities that are going on at the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. And scarily enough, if we had a serious accident at the nuclear power plant at Zaporozhye in Europe, I think it would probably be worse than the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. But I think that the effects around the world are heterogeneous. It is my belief, and we'll see it as far as nuclear energy markets, despite what we see with Germany, with nuclear energy, I think that except in France, which has a very well-established nuclear energy market, I actually think the appeal of nuclear energy is going to be substantially less in Europe in the future. And I think it's as a result of all the scaremongering and all the videos that we've seen about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and also the fact that a lot of countries that are in Central and Eastern Europe are actually dependent upon getting their nuclear fuel from Russia. And I think they're increasingly less interested in doing so. And the reactors are designed to get nuclear fuel from Russia. So I think we see that on one hand. But I also think that we're going to see a boon in nuclear energy because of the changes in energy markets, particularly in the global south. And we already see this beginning to happen now. But there's vast interest in nuclear energy. If you look in, for example, in Ghana, in Nigeria, and other countries. And when you start to talk to populations in those countries, surprise, surprise, they're not really scared about what's going on in Zaporozhye. It's not as proximate to them. And one of the other things is, as Russia's exports on different commodities have been cut off and have been sanctioned, one of the areas that Russia remains very active is being the world's largest provider of nuclear fuel and nuclear technology. And I think that Russia needs new outlets. And a lot of countries, in fact, that were unwilling to condemn the Russian invasion did so out of the idea of trade relationships with Russia. And many of them are banking on future nuclear energy markets and modernization from Russia. So I think it's going to be really interesting seeing what happens. And ironically enough, I think what we might see is countries that view themselves as foes or adversaries of Russia will probably take a turn away from nuclear energy, where countries which are more friendly or desire ties with Russia may actually turn more towards nuclear energy. All speculation now, still working on the research, processing the data, but I think it'll be quite fascinating.
There was a tour de force here, Stephen. Okay, apart from Cassandra, where can people follow your work?
I have my work online on my academic profiles at ETH and Harvard, and I'm also on Twitter at Herzog SM, and people can most certainly check me out there. I post all of my academic work, studies, media interviews, or the interesting ones. So
there was some time well spent. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Yep.
Cheers.